Okay, well, everyone, thank you for joining. I'm Britta. I am an independent journalist in New York and also the Vice President of Programming for the Newswomen's Club. If you're unfamiliar with our organization, it was started in 1922 as a way to support newswomen in media, specifically in New York, which is really what we're still doing today. We host panels, happy hours, networking events all throughout the year. So definitely check us out if you're a newswoman in New York. And today our panel is all about how to start a podcast and how to get into podcasting. So I will introduce our panelists. And since we are doing the speaker review, if you could just say hi to everyone after I say your name so people know who you are, that would be great. So today we have Caila Litman.
Hi guys, did I do it right, Britta?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
So Caila leads revenue strategy, marketing, and monetization efforts across Condé Nast portfolio of more than 23 podcasts. Working on the revenue operations side of the audio industry for nearly 4 years, she has led early stage audio efforts at Vox Media Podcast Network, Mental Floss, The Week, and Panoply. Caila also works as an independent podcast consultant, developing content and revenue strategies for mid-sized production studios, brands, and individual creators. We also have Golda Arthur.
Hi.
Golda is an independent podcast showrunner, audio producer, and journalist. At Vox Media, she launched and ran podcasts, including Recode's Land of the Giants, The Rise of Amazon. She also worked on Vox's news show, Today Explained. She has reported, edited, and produced for the BBC's flagship show, NewsHour, and has covered tech and news in radio and podcast form for Marketplace and CBC Radio, among other media. And then I don't know if is Jordan on the call. All right, I don't know. I'll have to ping her. Okay. But then we also have Alex Brook Lynn, who's a multimedia journalist. Oh, sorry, Alex. Hi. Alex, do you mind?
Hello. Hi, Alex.
So Alex is a multimedia journalist living in Manhattan. She is currently the executive producer and co-host of FAQ.NYC, a weekly NYC politics podcast, producer of Surveillance in the City, which is a weekly podcast about law enforcement and technology, and Manifesto, a monthly podcast on the nature of declarative truth. She has written and produced video content for The Daily Beast, The New York Daily News, The New York Press, and Vice. So for the first question, maybe we can just go around to the panelists. I'm curious to know what makes a successful podcast. And obviously that can be in terms of who's reading it, but also just why do people want to come to your podcast? Like, what is the secret sauce to a podcast, and how does that differ from like print or video? Golda, I see you nodding. Maybe you want to start with this.
I was nodding because I was processing whilst hoping that Alex or Caila would jump in and answer. I think that's a really important question, Britta, and I don't know why it's really hard to answer that accurately. But I can say very briefly, like from my perspective, in terms of the podcasts that I've made and that the podcasts I would listen to regularly, the podcasts that I come back to over and over again, I think it's a combination of a show being highly relevant to my life, like really relevant. There's a lot to listen to out there. There's a lot of good stuff to listen to out there as well. But I don't always have the time to listen to all of the things that I want to listen to. So I think that the podcasts that I love listening to over and over again, and what makes a good podcast is how deeply can you connect with your listeners. And that ability to connect is difficult to reverse engineer when you're making it, but when you are on the listening side, I think, and when you connect with something, like I will regularly, it used to be called shouting at the radio, but I will regularly like talk to the host who's not talking, who's not really talking back to me, but to be like, oh, hell yes, that was a great point, make it again. Or, oh my God, I can't believe they're doing this, or something like that, right? So that ability to sort of be in conversation and to just be deeply relevant and to be engaging to me and just me alone is, I think, is what makes a good podcast, is how can you connect with one other person?
Caila, what do you think?
You saw me go off mute. Okay. So just to be clear, like Golda and Alex, you two are both on the journalism end. You're on the production end. You're really thinking through the nitty gritty of how to tell the story. And my work in this industry has been about the stakeholders who are looking to make the most money possible. And that's not to say that I don't have an appreciation and haven't worked on the production side here and there, but I think for the people who I work for at a big publisher like Condé, and also previously at Vox and other publications, is they're looking to see how can they come up with a podcast that is not only relevant, but also can reach the largest possible audience, because that's what's going to unlock the most amount of revenue. I think that the reason why this industry is still nascent or new is because there's no one major publisher or even audio first type of creator that has cracked the code. I think personally, I listen to a lot of podcasts and I listen to shows that don't necessarily have massive audiences, but still are super relevant for me. And I think it's one of those mediums where there's something for everybody, and the value of the audience from a revenue standpoint is not necessarily the scale, like getting 1 million downloads per episode. It's the value of that listener. So if only 500 people listen to your podcast about entrepreneurship, but there are 500 people who are in the C-suite, that's a super valuable audience, and that's what makes it, a good podcast for what it's trying to do. So I don't know, there's a lot of ways to answer this question, but my favorite thing about the medium is that it's supposed to be about imperfections. It's supposed to be about humanity. And part of my challenge at a place like Condé is making them realize, like, the glossy magazines, that's not what people want when they come to audio. They don't want the Photoshop. They want the opposite of that. They want the humanity. I'll throw it over to Alex if she has something to add.
Yeah, I mean, both of the podcasts at the moment, the two ones that I am most involved in, like on a weekly basis, FAQ.NYC, it's exactly like you said. It has like a really dedicated listenership of, in the weeds, New York City, politics obsessed people and local activists, journalists, and politicians. So that's like a really built-in but kind of small crowd. And I think expanding on that, one, I think people like it because we're really human. We make mistakes. One of my hosts, Christina Greer, she's very practiced. She's on MSNBC all the time. And the other, Harry Siegel, is like a long-term editor for a newspaper. So there's a lot of like fumbles, but it's real. It's just, it's not fumbles in thought. It's just like that New York conversation. So it's very germane to the kind of stuff we're talking about. Now, I'm always trying to drag it. I think one of the roles of a good producer is, how can you expand this? And not just expand the audience for monetary reasons, although it is nice to be able to keep going and pay an audio engineer and things like that, but to expand it. So like, take these kind of like insular politics. I want to drag that and make it accessible. So a lot of the segments I do, a lot of the addendum episodes, it's trying to drag it into a space where more people can kind of access it and have a little bit of a bridge to what previously has this like huge education gate. If you want to listen to our podcast, the trouble I find with it is that a lot of times you need to know a lot of New York City history, but every week we work against that almost. It's almost like We're too granular. And you get that with some podcasts that are extremely successful. Chapo Trap House, Bad Faith. These are like, sometimes I'm listening to them and I'm like, damn, I need to read up on some national politics this week. But I'm always listening to them doing the same thing I'm doing, trying to drag it back, trying to make it more accessible. Because if it's something I know about or I relate to, that's awesome. And I'll listen to it all day. But I'm still a fan of that old school, like Radio Lab, where they always bring it back, like intermittently. As you're talking to someone, it's almost like they're your friends and going, oh, okay, by the way, let's just roll back and like, make this comfortable. Like you're telling a story to your friend at a bar who has no idea about the inner politics of Albany. And they're just like lighting up because the way you're telling it is engaging. And I think expanding and making every subject accessible is kind of a really good goal, no matter how small or niche the podcast is.
I want to actually, something that you said, Alex. I think the thing about sound as well, it makes me think that the thing about sound, working in sound, is that it is a very intimate medium. I mean, some of the hosts that I was training a month ago, I was trying to tell them, you are literally the voice inside someone's head, right? When you put your headphones on, you hear that person's voice in like a physiological way between your ears. And sometimes, when I'm editing something, I'll have someone's voice kind of running around in my brain. Like that's quite a big deal. I mean, it can be a very powerful medium. So the need to be careful with how you treat that medium is also, I think, a thing. But I happen to think that sound can be an incredibly visual, intimate thing. And I think all of these secret sauces kind of, pull on that as well.
I mean, one of the best ideas I've never actually gotten to produce was wanting to, Robert Altman is a filmmaker who uses sound. Like you walk through a space with him in his movies and you hear all these little snippets of conversation. It feels like real life. I've always wanted to make a podcast kind of like that, like someone like walking down the street or something, and like you go with them through their day. But it is so intimate, Totally agree.
And one of the things that I like, all of the pieces that you're talking about, I'm talking to clients all the time. Like these are major advertisers that have billions of dollars to spend on advertising, and they don't understand right now. They're like, well, why should I be spending in podcasts? And I'm like, well, when someone tells you a recommendation, you get a word of mouth recommendation. How does that resonate with you differently than if you receive that in another medium? And so it's that whole idea that you're tapping into this very, again, human thing of just being that little birdie in someone's ear. And I just find it so exciting too about how different formats are operating in this medium and how accessible and authentic it allows for journalists to be, but also for different types of personalities to really come to the fore and come to life in a place where they don't need to be so guarded. It doesn't need to be so polished like it is on a movie set or a TV set. So I try to convey that to, the Procter and Gamble's of the world or whoever it might be. And it's starting to resonate as budgets go up, but it is all about that storytelling, because the type of creative that you get for a podcast ad versus the actual podcast, it's not that far of a leap away. It's still the spoken word. It's still the sound and scene.
Well, I just want to make one comment to what Caila had said too, that with authenticity, that at least for me and talking to our audience, that they can tell when you're bullshitting them and to not bullshit them, pardon my French, but just want to make that apparent. But I also wanted to share just a quick story that when you know that your work is resonating with people that you might not necessarily think are your audience, that I was preparing some interviews with some people who are incarcerated. And one of the people that I was talking to had said, oh my gosh, I really love your host. I watch him every week on TV. And oh my gosh, and I just, it like the light bulb went off in my head. I went and talked to one of the product managers and was like, we have an audience here. Like there are people who trust our host, they're unable to listen to the podcast, but they watch a show on TV, that like also just realizing that your audience may not be who you think they are, and not to be afraid of that, and to then lean into that new audience.
Yeah. Also, Jordan, sorry you missed the introductions, but I just want to say this is Jordan, who's a podcast producer and investigative journalist. And she is currently a producer with CNN, and she's also the founder of the women-led audio collective Local Switchboard NYC, and a producer of SPLC's Sounds Like Hate podcast. So I just want to introduce you. And also quickly, if you have questions, feel free to private message me, because there will be some time for questions at the end. But Caila, I kind of want to go off something that you have been talking about, which is the fact that podcasts can be messy, right? And there is like room for experimentation. And so I'm curious to know, if you're interested in getting into a podcast, how you approach that in terms of editing. And maybe Alex, you can talk a little bit about this too. Like, how edited should a podcast be? And should there be like, should you keep like the bloopery stuff in it? I mean, it depends on what kind of podcast you're doing. And Jordan, maybe, you know, podcasts at CNN are less so for putting in the mess ups. But I'm curious to hear like the editing process of a podcast.
So in the spirit of allowing a podcast to have like an evolution, I used to, when FAQ.NYC started, I used to it would take me probably a straight 11 hours, because not only was I wasn't really editing mistakes out. I was editing anything they mentioned. I wanted them to be as natural as possible. And anything they mentioned, they had the hosts at the time, it was Ozzy Pabera from the Times, Harry Siegel, Christina Garrett. So they had such a huge store of knowledge that they would just mention things off the cuff. And then I would go back, find a sound clip from something they referenced with Giuliani in 1995, and then put in like a 30-second explainer for what it was, what year it was. So I was doing a lot of work, and it was great. But that amount of work with one person wasn't super sustainable. And it was just, it just like in the long run, the episodes sounded really great. But in the long run, we decided that it would be better to just keep it conversational. And if something really needed to be explained, force one of them to like stay after. So I wasn't doing so much of the edit, because the idea about this thing is also that you want to be able to let it grow, let it breathe, make it complicated, and then allow it to scale back too. And that really helped me prep to create podcasts with a template, like in the future, where what we did with Surveillance in the City.
Jordan, I'm curious to hear like about at CNN, when you're a news focused podcast, like what that process is like, especially in terms of editing and in terms of choosing what kind of news stories you're putting on the podcast.
Yeah, well, I think for one, the show that I work on, because it's coronavirus focused, that it does give you some boundaries to work within. And also it's, 10 to 15 minutes long each episode, usually like right around 10 minutes. So you have those time constraints to think about. And we have been pretty templated now, but there is room for some creativity. But I mention all of this because I think it's easier in some respects, and also harder, but easier in some respects to edit things, because you're not looking to create a super sound rich episode because it's a daily show. So the expectations, not to say that they're lower, but you have a better idea. I think, your audience is coming to the show to get a 10-minute quick digestible bit of information about topics ranging, various rate from COVID. So editing is usually not that difficult, because like I said, there's such limited amount of voices that it's just how quickly can you edit and how can you experiment. So, you talked a little bit about experimentation, but how can you experiment within all of those boundaries that I mentioned? So, that's been my experience with it. Now, when you're talking about something like the show that's, partially funded by SPLC, Sounds Like Hate, that is a longer investigative series, way more sound rich. And that editing process, it takes months, we're a very small team as well. And that's a whole different can of worms for editing.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, maybe we can walk through the like lifespan of a podcast. Like, let's say you have your idea and it's like, okay, how do I actually execute this? And maybe Golda, you can start us off with this of like from birth to actually publishing your episode, like your first episode. What goes into that?
Yeah, I'm just like, very triggering question, because I just remembered that in 2019, I launched a podcast in 5 weeks, and it was called Reset. And I loved her very much. She is no more with us. Rest in peace. But anyway, 5 weeks. Yeah. So I have, I guess because I've been in these rooms where somebody is saying, hey, can you launch a podcast in a month? And I'm like, no, but yeah, okay, let's do it anyway. I have like a very, I'm like super organized only in my work life. My personal life is a disaster. And I'm super organized about the stages that people have to go through and what we have to do. And I think I am somebody who, the most important question for me is why. I know people who don't care about the why, only care about the what. Somebody else I know like only cared about the when. But for me, the first thing I'm like, why are we doing this? Why does this podcast need to exist? And why should a listener listen to it? And that bit takes a lot of time and thinking and discussion to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And so that's the first stage for me. Once you get past the why, I think I move straight on to the what. And the what for me is really easy. The people that I work with, we try and put the what in one sentence, basically. And that sentence will often become the tagline to the show. And that also, it takes a little bit of time. I feel like once I'm done with the why, the what comes really easily. The third stage for me is the how. And this is the tricky bit. This is the bit where my secret like career wish to be an architect when I was a small child really comes into play, because this is the building stage. I think you want to think about in that how stage, you want to think about when is launch date and work backwards from there to reverse engineer it. And I usually set a series of markers. So if, let's say we're in March and we're launching in June, I would say by the end of May, X thing has to have happened. By the end of April, Y thing needs to have happened. So you're hitting these markers along the way. I've never worked on a show that met these deadlines before launch. Never. I don't know if you guys know of a show that has. And so, so some of it is like what needs to be done at which point. And the other big part of it is who is the team? Like who are the people who are going to be carrying this thing? And putting together their strengths and weaknesses in the same bucket as your deadlines, in the same bucket as the why. Like that's the messiest bit, I think. And so that's the thing that I tend to pour over and think about. I try and look, it's like, defensive driving. I try and look like 20 seconds down the road to see where am I going to get in trouble? Like, where can I see an ember burning that I know is going to be a fire by next Wednesday when I'm there, and try and sort of like put those out. And, there's always things that kind of come up. So that to me is like the launch stage of making. And then of course you get closer to the time. And I've always worked on teams where there's a lot of collaboration with the revenue folks, with the marketing folks. And I take a lot of joy from that because it gets me out of my own head. It gets me out of the editorial space because, when you've been working with a concept for so long, this is my podcast, this is what it means to listeners, here's the ins and outs. And then somebody from marketing or revenue will come along and ask you like this deadly simple question. And I'll just sit there and be like, oh, I don't know why anyone would listen to it. So, or, something like that. I think that's really good to expose your idea to a bunch of other people who are invested in your success. And that's if you're kind of working in a team, in a larger team as well. But I think even if you're just making a podcast on your own and working on a smaller team, it is a highly collaborative process. You need to work with people well. You need to come to the table understanding what you're willing to compromise on and what you are not willing to compromise on. And then hopefully all of that comes together and you launch the show. And that's when the real problems start, because then you have to figure out how to keep it going after it's launched, which I do think is like a whole other, maybe a whole other panel discussion. But I like to think of, what is sustainable? Like what's your infrastructure? Like you've built a thing, and that thing must now stand on its own two legs and not need you to prop it up all the time. So I've always just tried to create a system where the show, one way or the other, takes care of itself, so you can go on vacation for a while or something.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of a team behind a podcast, people or listeners specifically might not quite get. Like, we think of like The Daily is Michael Barbaro, but there's a whole team, and like all these podcasts are not just the hosts and the people who are in your ear talking. There's reporters and editors and producers. So Jordan, I see you nodding. Can you talk a little bit about like the teams behind these podcasts? And do you need a big team? I mean, Golda, you mentioned there are small teams and big teams. And obviously, if you're part of a big news organization, you have the resources behind you. But how do you go about this if you're just one person or two people? I mean, what goes into this?
I'll say really, to me or Jordan, Britta?
Either one. You can, Golda, you can go and we can hop to Jordan.
Okay. Britta, I'll say, Jordan, I'll say a 10-second thing. I am trying to launch my own podcast, and the staff on it is me. But then my husband is my editor, and my son, who's a budding composer, is going to do some music for it. And then my best friend is my other editor. And that, like, I think even if you're doing things on your own, another pair of ears or somebody else who wants you to succeed in life, who can like write your episode descriptions better than you can, I think it's really important to have like a bunch of people involved. So I'll turn it over to Jordan.
The reason I nod about the host and how some listeners believe that the host does everything is because I feel compelled at times to let people who I'm interviewing, well, one, I'll mention to them, do you want to be on the podcast, the CNN podcast? Oh my gosh, I'm going to be interviewed by the host. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but you're going to be interviewed by me or another producer. And I explain the process, and they just crestfallen when I'm on the Zoom call with them. And they're like, wait, he didn't write the questions? He didn't write he's not going to write the script. And I'm like, I'm going to break it down. And often I will, there is a workflow, there is a team, this person has other positions within this company too. And it's just interesting, when you explain this to someone who's not in the podcasting industry or whatever, just the way I think that I like to think they gain more appreciation for the show. I would like to think after that.
Mm-hmm.
If I can just interject real quick, I think that even some newsrooms, editors in chiefs and even some of the hosts have a hard time grappling with that. I worked at Gawker Media, which has like Jezebel, Deadspin, it used to, when it existed, it had like Jezebel and Deadspin and a bunch of different brands. And this is first when, live streaming and podcasts were really kind of blowing up. And even to explain to a brand's biggest writers, whether I was at Vice, Gawker, Daily Beast, how it worked, and that they wouldn't have to do everything. And it was just very difficult for a lot of people to get their mind around, especially when you work with budgets and people who have not been in the multimedia space before. Say they're just like print or written journalism. They know photos and they know writing, but they don't really understand why it's going to cost what it costs. It's basically why there's going to be so many people involved. So there is a lot of education that like it takes to do something collaboratively. And it is such a relief when I end up working on passion projects with friends who already get it. It's much better.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like it's becoming easier to educate people as like podcasts have really exploded, or do you think it's still difficult to get that across?
Honestly, I mean, if you take a look at the industry, which I mean, it's been a while since I had a desire to like work for a single company full time. But in consulting with a lot of these companies, it is changing somewhat, but you'll see different structures across every different newsroom, right? Like New York Times, I think in the past 7 years has changed their video / podcast structure at least 4 times. Condé Nast, as far as I know, went from having each individual brands be served by like individual types of teams. And now Condé does a collective team, except I believe for the New Yorker, because they have a very specific editorial voice, so they outsource. I'm not sure if I'm getting that right, but so every company right now is really struggling to find like the magic combination of how to do this across their brands. I think Vice did it really, really well at the beginning, but they did it on the backs of some bad business practices, which now have changed because a lot of the company leadership has changed over. So I'm excited to see where they go, having built that multimedia infrastructure originally.
And Alex, I'll add to that, like one thing that's been interesting at Condé too is, so the New York Times newsroom for the Daily, a lot of the producers, all the producers, they're journalists in their own right. So they're going into the newsroom and they're finding the stories and they're reporting on them, and they don't have to take it up the ladder to get it approved before it goes out the door. And a real stopgap for a lot of our producers here is that for the Vogue episodes, for example, they had to be approved up the ladder by the leadership at Vogue. So they were treating the producers more like, okay, this is like the production support, not the audio journalist, and like for it to be authentic and come out the door looking and sounding a certain way, you kind of need to like trust your producer, trust your team to do it, because they're making the creative for audio because they're the audio experts. So having to have people who don't get audio also approve that was a real challenge to roll things out the door at a given time every week.
Having done consulting, just explaining to people that your producer is not an IT technician. They're not going to fix your computer as well. They're a journalist, or they're a creator, or they're a storyteller. It's been an interesting few years, but yes, I do think it's getting better.
So Caila, just going off what you just said, getting podcast episodes approved, what kind of things get approved? Are there trends that you're following? Are there things that you guys have like tried to stay away from? How does that process work?
Yeah, there's a few things that kind of like what Golda alluded to. There's a stage in the production where you start talking to the revenue side and you start talking to the marketers who are trying to roll it out the door to ensure that it grows. The number of downloads per episode is set up to succeed. And then there are certain things that you need to do to ensure that it's going to market so it sells before it goes live. So just to give you like the kind of tail end of what goes into making a podcast, I'll say that about 6 to 8 weeks before you launch, you want to be able to have conversations with the Apples and the Spotifys of the world, typically bringing them like an audio trailer of your show. So what succeeds is typically what the platforms are promoting. So a lot of platforms have different editorial initiatives, like Spotify will be doing something specifically for Women's History Month. And we know that Apple is also doing a ton of stuff for different sort of tentpole moments that they have. So they're going to want to elevate what you as a CNN or you as a Vox are doing at those moments, to say, look at all of these different podcasts that we have that you can listen to from these premium publishers. And sometimes it doesn't even need to be from a major publishing house. It can be from an individual, but they've seen that, oh, this is really interesting and we want to elevate this to our listeners. So that's something you want to keep in mind in terms of going to market. And another thing that's very interesting, there's this big study that comes out every year, typically every March, and it's sort of like the Super Bowl of podcast stats. It's the Edison Research Study. And it's sort of like these two guys who are very much like car talk guys talking about podcast listenership, audio listenership across the board. And this year, the study came out last week. they're finding that traditionally podcast was a space where mostly it was male dominated listenership, but that gap is closing. And now more and more women are listening to podcasts across the board. Mind you, it's still only 222 million people in the United States over the age of 12 who are familiar with a podcast. So we still have a ways to go to be on level with like, standard digital media, but it's still a quarter of our country that is listening and thinking about podcasts as a channel they want to ingest. So I think that's interesting. I also think what's interesting is more female consumers have come to the plate and want to listen to more content as podcasts. There's areas where we're seeing growth, like beauty and wellness podcasts have exploded. This was a big white space. And now there's even more demand for that, not only from advertisers, but from publications that could have a really cool extension to what they're already doing in audio. So if you have a good idea about this particular area, go pitch a publication and say, hey, I want to work with you, make a podcast about it. A lot of big publications right now are very thirsty to have a podcast idea because they need to demonstrate that they have multiple channels that they're reaching their audience. I forgot what your question was, Britta. I feel like I got excited.
No, that's great. I mean, well, I want to ask too, kind of piggybacking off what you're saying about trends. I actually just had a friend who's not a journalist ask me what's hot in journalism right now, meaning like, what are people writing about? And, for a while, obviously true crime was big, which I guess maybe still is. And I'm curious to know what the trends are and if it matters if you stay on trend, or is it even better to just like go off trend and do something funky? And what is like the tension between that?
So I would say what's interesting right now, advertisers, is they were really hot on true crime because there's a lot of downloads there. But now they're like, ooh, is it brand safe to be surrounding murder? We're like, what? So I think that's starting to be a conversation too. But I also think what's an interesting trend that I'm starting to see is there's a big movement for more scripted podcasts versus conversational. So more narrative podcasts, sort of like what Alex was talking about, where she's sourcing the clips to add into the conversation. Whereas for many years, the basis of this entire industry is like a Joe Rogan conversation or a Call Her Daddy, like these just not fact-checked conversations, not journalists, just personalities having conversations. And so the big trend, which is meaningful for everybody in this room, is that journalism is the trend. It's like, oh, a fact-checked podcast, that sounds maybe interesting and valuable compared to just listening to a conversation that is a little bit more fly on the wall, two friends hashing it out. So that's something I've observed for sure.
Speaking of fact check podcasts, can I just throw out there that for folks who have not worked on a fact check podcast, that it does take a lot of time, that these things, and for people who listen to podcasts that are investigative or are actually journalism, that there is a lot of time and work and devotion that goes into this. So just the separation of the two mediums, and I'm glad to hear that the trend is for journalism than anything else. But just throwing it out there to everyone that has worked on and has been a fact checker. I salute you, I should say. In fact, a good fact checker is hard to find.
Did anyone else want to jump in on that question?
I think that we're going to actually see, and this is a personal prediction, I think that just going back to something that was said, I'm not sure who said it, but sustainability in creating a series, right? I think what we're going to see is a lot more short series. So, you have these amazing short series on video, right? Ken Burns doesn't come out with the Vietnam War endlessly. He comes out with a 10-part series. And what I think is going to happen is that we're going to start seeing a lot of people be able to shop what's called like an evergreen concept around. So they can make either a historical or like a deep dive into a subject kind of like short series and then shop that around as like as something that people can download forever. And this is some podcasts that were very popular at the beginning. Hardcore History, Philosophize This, even now The Dollop, although they're rooted in some contemporary politics, they do history. And I think you're going to see some like cool, really creative ways to do like a 6-episode thing, a 10-episode thing, exploring and expanding a single subject. And I'm interested to see what people come up with. And it's sustainable because like you can hire people for a project, which is also appealing to larger companies to fund because they can just put you on contract. And one of the ones that I really liked recently was Blowback. I think a couple of the Chapo guys, whether you like them or not, a couple of the Chapo guys got together to explain both all of our involvement in the Gulf since I believe like 1989. So it was a really interesting 10-part series.
Great. I think we should move to questions. There are some coming in, so I want to try to get through them. The first one is actually for specifically Caila, although if anyone else has thoughts, feel free to jump in. But the question is, I'm interested in knowing how Caila deals with trying to explain the importance of podcasts and new media and ideas to people in higher positions who don't understand our rapidly evolving society and what new generations are interested in. And Alex, I feel like you touched a little bit on this, but basically like to people who don't understand, how do you pitch a podcast and explain it?
It's a great question. I think that part of it is internally at like old guard media companies, you have to re-explain the wheel to them. And I think the benefit, first of all, of podcasts is that this is not like a net new concept. Hello, radio. Like we're not like really going off our rockers here trying to do something. It's just something that's happening on the internet. And I think that part of what's really been resonating in my time in this industry has been talking about attention span, talking about how we all have a finite amount of attention and time that we can dedicate to our media consumption, and talking about ways that you can guarantee that you're really attracting an audience's full attention. And so a lot of what we consume right now that's outside of print and podcast is something that you have to really give yourself some undivided time to, or you don't have the undivided time for it because there's a lot of distractions. So talking about attention span, talking about how you reach an audience's attention, and really driving home that is the value of these new mediums, is that just because you didn't think about the value, or you weren't thinking that it was something you should have as part of your mix of where you're telling your story, doesn't mean that somebody's not paying attention here and giving you really valuable quality attention. So there's a million statistics that help support this, but I think that that's the most human thing that has resonated with like my SVPs, is like, oh, this is just part of the equation. This is just part of where people are listening and looking, and part of that sight, sound, and mind experience that you have when you're thinking of a media mix, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Golda, this might be a good one for you, but is it possible to successfully do a one-man band podcast?
I don't know. I've never tried it.
Starting out, yeah.
I think it depends on the podcast. It depends on how skillful you are. I mean, you know, I'm good at some things, but I'm not good at all of the things that are needed, I think, to send a podcast out into the world. And I've never met anyone who is. So I think, let me say this. Yes, it's possible. Are you willing to give up the rest of your life to do it? Maybe, maybe not, because it's a lot of work. And, you know, why not gather like a brain trust of your 4 best friends or supporters who might be able to help out? Because again, it's entirely possible to launch something very quickly, a good thing very quickly. Keeping it going is quite another thing, certainly keeping it going on your own.
Mm-hmm.
but I wouldn't stop anyone from trying. Go for it.
Okay, what advice do you have, I guess anyone, for someone who has no podcast experience but is interested in working in the field? So how do you break in?
I think there are a lot of advertisements for entry-level jobs like Glassdoor and things like that. I think right now, whereas I would not have said this 5 years ago, there are a lot of good programs that aren't necessarily four-year college programs. I know in New York, like DCTV and a bunch of different places have specifically like podcast courses. If you want to break in for a company, it really depends on what kind of podcast you're doing. There's also people who fund podcasts. ITVS is one of them. I know they hire, and just like being around it. Getting an entry-level position in a newsroom is a little difficult because that's very specific to like journalism and having a resume there. But there are entry-level positions for like PAs and runners and researchers and things like that.
Is there, in your experience, a traditional ladder to move up, or is it more of an untraditional, you can come in at various times and have different paths?
I think it really depends on the company and the people that are running the multimedia department, whether they're willing to experiment and whether they're willing to think a little bit outside of the classic structure of a media company, which they've all been forced to do a little bit, but some hold on more than others. So there is some opportunity. I think like researching the companies that you might want to work for, working for smaller companies. And honestly, even though I'm not I'm not someone who works for a lot of like brand strategy places, but I have consulted for a few and done graphics for a few, that I think those are really good places to start too, because they have less of a gate around the content they create. They're creating a lot of different specifically like brand paid for content. And it's not editorial, so it's not as like coveted of entry level positions. And it's a good place to like see how it works.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'll say that, if you want to get into podcasting, you have a couple of decisions ahead of you, right? Are you going to get into journalistic podcasting or just content podcasting? Because, podcast can be anything. And I think if you are going to join a newsroom or a media organization and you want to break into podcasting in the journalism route, there is a structure, and how you move up or sideways, there's definitely like a structure to get into, and some of that is just decided by the nature of audio. So an audio engineer is a highly technical job, and the better the engineer, the more experienced the engineer in terms of working with programs called Pro Tools, Adobe Audition, all of these. They're basically, somebody is going to shit on me for this, but they're souped up versions of GarageBand. And I say that all the engineers who are my friends will hate me for saying that because it's incredibly unsophisticated. But this is a sound editing program, right? So if you have technical skills and you want to work with, moving bits of sound to the left or the right and all this kind of stuff, that's probably the route you're going to go in. If you want to be in the editorial context, you're probably going to do a little bit different of a path. So that's what I mean about, the structure being a little bit different. There are hybrid producers. There are people who do both engineering and producing. In my experience, they're very rare. But I think that there's definitely a structure there.
I mean, at the beginning, they tried to make every reporter I knew of hold up a cell phone to record various things so they wouldn't have to hire like audio engineers and producers around the world, especially for like satellite offices. And what ended up happening was they got a bunch of like unusable audio.
Yeah.
I do just want to throw into community radio stations are a really good way to get some experience. Some pay, some don't, but providing training opportunities and access to Adobe Audition or other platforms, audio editing platforms. So in Brooklyn, there's WBAI that I'll plug, because with Local Switchboard, they were kind enough for our first year to air our newscast once a week. And so also a great way if you want to get into hosting or want to be able to have your voice heard on air and start building an audience. And also there's programs like BRIC, for instance, BRIC, which is also in Brooklyn. And, whatever city you're in, there tends to now be, I find, some sort of co-op audio collective program there that is also willing to help you learn podcasting skills, and oftentimes for free or on a sliding scale.
I mean, there's also, if you want to get into, I think both Alex and Jordan hit on a really good point, is that there's a lot of training. Well, there's enough training out there right now for things like the technical skills and to think in audio, to learn to think in audio, like Union Docs, for example, which I think is a little bit more skewed towards making highly produced narrative audio. But, you don't have to go back to school. You don't have to do any of that stuff. And on-the-job training does exist. You could also just make your own podcast. The barrier to entry is very low. It's not hard. I once hired someone. She came to us from a local radio, and it was a choice between her and somebody else who had a relatively similar background. And I hired her because she made a podcast. And her podcast was herself and three of her best friends having a glass of wine on a Friday night and just talking about, they were all news journalists. So they were just talking about the stuff that happened during the week. And the thing that alerted me to the fact that she knew what she was doing was during the interview, I said, how do you find that making that podcast? I mean, it did not sound good. And she admitted it was like, I just do this in my off time. She said, you know what? It's so hard. And then she rattled off a bunch of things, tension points in how hard it is to keep a podcast going and how she had solved for those problems. This is her and three friends, glass of wine, Friday night. And I thought, damn, like this is what I'm looking for. Somebody who understands the realities of putting this audio out there. And she's so committed to this medium that she just needs to be in this space. Like she's compelled to just make this podcast. And I think that, especially if you have a subject area, or if you have podcasts are quite niche these days, if you have an area where you think, I could talk about this for an hour, and you do, and here's how you can subscribe. I think that sends a message out to potential employers to be like, I care about this stuff enough to kind of, put this out there. And I think that's also a good thing to do.
So there are a few questions on here about Clubhouse and how / if Clubhouse is going to affect the podcasting space. If anyone has thoughts about that. And for those who might not know, it's a new, basically it's kind of like a live podcasting app where you can join different rooms and listen to people have conversations. And there are like many different rooms you can join. Anyways, it seems like it's kind of exploding. So
I think that it's so different, the consumption rate. Like Clubhouse is trying to play on a model that's specifically around the social media space where you just open it automatically. And it's kind of like a reactive platform. So, when people started trying to do shows on Instagram, they're not as highly watched as, say, YouTube, because YouTube is a place where you can go and visit a specific person and a specific channel, but Instagram is like a reactive and a scroll. And so Clubhouse is reactive, and I think it's definitely going to be important for its own thing, but it's kind of like going to a party as opposed to going to a movie. And I think a lot of podcasts are like, oh, I'm going to listen to this week's whatever it is. It's that's my projection though. Who can say?
I have a lot of thoughts about Clubhouse, and it gets brought up a lot in, just advertising meetings, because people want to know, how can we be leveraging this new exciting place? I don't think it will actually encroach on podcasts because, like Alex said, it's a completely different listening experience. It's not polished audio. It's not sort of editorially calendared out in such a way where you even know what's going to happen, because anybody or their mom can just pop in and start the conversation in these platforms. But I do think it's a really important signal that podcast is one piece of an audio ecosystem. So yes, podcast I think is the most premium listening experience, but then there's all these other places where people are prioritizing audio as the place that they want to consume. So that also means that Twitter has its own version of Clubhouse called Spaces. And there's a bunch of things that have started trending on Twitter because they happened in a Spaces conversation. It also means like smart speaker. People are trying to create content that's specific to smart speaker. So it means that there's all these different places in which audio has become valuable, but it's not just about video or text anymore. It's also about audio.
Okay, and then this question, which maybe will be our last unless we can squeeze one other, but this goes to audience, which actually I wanted to ask about too. But have you noticed the pandemic affecting podcast listenership? I used to listen to podcasts on my commutes and I don't have that anymore. And Caila, you talked a lot about audience. So did the pandemic affect anything, and who's listening?
So what we saw on our network, just like across all the shows, is that when the pandemics first started, which, oh my God, how have we been doing this for a whole year? We saw that there was a dip in listeners because, yeah, people listened on their commute. And then quickly in about April or May, our network bounced back. And there's also some industry articles that demonstrate that this was happening elsewhere. And what happened is people who liked podcasts started listening at home and started listening more on weekends and evenings. So it became a behavioral thing where people adapted to their new circumstances and started listening at different times of the day. And so our publishing platform will show you when the peak listening has happened or when peak downloads happen. And so I thought that was rather interesting. And I think it's part of the reason that these other audio elements like smart speaker and Clubhouse have had sort of a renaissance, because people are fitting it into their day. Like they're finding ways to fit it into their day regardless of what their commute looks like, thankfully.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I have one last question, and I think we can go around, and I want to ask all the panelists. What is the most challenging thing for you about producing or making a podcast, and how do you overcome that challenge? How have you dealt with it? Jordan, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I can start us off. I think one of the most challenging things for me overall making a podcast is, and this might, I'll preface this with zodiac sign Leo here and everything that comes with that. But having conversations about who should be the host and who should be heard, what voices need to be on a particular show, and for what reason. I've found a lot of conflicts with certain shows that I've worked with before. About the reasoning that, okay, if you want to do an international podcast, why are you tapping the British person? Because by default, that international shows are typically hosted by people with an English accent. Okay, well, maybe we might want to rethink our idea of what an international podcast is and what it sounds like. So that's one example. And having these conversations and also in terms of language too, that when you're writing the scripts and how you talk about subjects in your script. For instance, we had something where someone used the term Indian, and it was, here's a link to a style guide, for instance, that what is the complication of maybe using that term for someone who is Indigenous? Is these things that have built up over time with me, but I see them across multiple platforms. That would be the biggest issues for me.
Mm-hmm. Golda?
Yeah, I think, this is very personal to me, I think, but I've been working in audio a long time and I love it. And I think the most challenging thing that I find is how to pull back from it. I tend to get like really involved and really passionate, and I think I'm always telling myself to kind of keep a distance between the thing that I'm making and myself. And it's really hard because I'm forever putting myself in the place of a listener and trying to figure out, what is the content that really lands in what I'm making, and sort of toggle between keeping a distance as an editor, but also like just creating engaging material as a producer. And one way or the other, I don't know when I'm going to learn my lesson. I always get like too involved in the stuff, even on podcasts that I don't even like making. So it's strange. It's really weird. And so I think that's it. I think I just get lost in this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Alex, how about you? What's challenging for you?
A bit of the same. Trying to keep it simple, not taking on too many projects at once. I have a lot of different kinds of ideas, some extremely didactic, like when it comes to politics, or like, let's do this on, evil dystopian surveillance tech that the NYPD is using, and not getting too obsessed with it, because there is other stuff I want to do. There's like audio soundscapes, there's audio as art, which is an entirely other genre that I think is going to start being explored in like some of those more experimental spaces, even like fashion magazines and things like that. Hearing, storytelling from someone that sounds like, beautiful and whatever in Paris, and you see these trends happening, and you kind of want to follow them, but you also want to keep it simple, and you want to keep it real with what you're pursuing as a passion, as opposed to what you're pursuing, I guess, as a career. And separating those, and just not becoming overwhelmed with how kind of incredibly inspiring and glorious and all-encompassing audio in general can be. And then also, of course, funding is a huge challenge. Do I pitch a show where it's going to become, like, to say you pitched a Vice or something, it's going to become a Vice property? Or do I try to get a grant? Do I become like somebody's producer? Or do I become my own man, so to speak, and like go get a grant or try to make a Patreon? And with that comes selling myself on Instagram for like, listen to me, and these are reasons. And funding is a really difficult and also exciting road right now, but there's a lot of pitfalls there. So it's all hard. But the good part about it being hard, I think, is deciding between all these different, like, really incredibly beautifully artistic and inspiring ways to like get sound out there.
Great. And then Caila, we'll end with you.
I don't feel like I could add to this. I feel like the ad and the revenue space are kind of in contradiction to making good podcasting, because they're going to try to nickel and dime you. And I mean, what I try to do in my role is preserve the integrity of the production and like not compromise it. But there's going to be a come to Jesus moment in the ad part of this industry, because they're so used to personalities and not journalists reading their ads, endorsing their products. And with the growth in journalism and the growth of podcasting really being a vehicle to tell amazing stories that are well reported, that's going to create friction. And so just because somebody is saying, no, that's not monetizable, don't take no for an answer, because there's a lot of education that needs to be happening with creative execs who are doing the green lighting. They want to be part of these monumental reporting moments, and you just need to get them across that finish line. So don't say no. The revenue side will always say no if they don't see money there, but there's always going to be an opportunity where you can build an audience and a great story. The audience will always come. Wow.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you to everyone for joining, and thank you to the panelists. And I will figure out a way somehow to put this on our website, the recording. Again, I'm Britta Lochting. I'm the Vice President of Programming for the Newswomen's Club. We have great programming coming up, so please follow us. And definitely, if you're interested in podcasting, check out the resources that our panelists, passed along. And thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.